Okay, so for this video, we're going to do this bottom one. There are survey samples, observation, and bias. And again, I'm just going to read what I've written, and it's important for you to pause the video so that you're able to write it down and listen to what I say. Okay, so we have a lot of different types of samples. And so the first one we have is a census. And remember, a census just looks at the entire population. And then we have a simple random survey, which is also called, or simple random sample, which is also called an SRS. It's at random, and it's from the whole population. So this is the only one that everybody has an equal chance of being selected. The advantage is it's easy and non-biased. The disadvantage is you got to know the population. Sometimes you don't know the whole population, and you can't identify numbers for the whole population. All right, the next type is a stratified. And a stratified is when you divide population into homogeneous groups, which are called strata. And remember, homogeneous is like groups. So I separate freshmen, I separate sophomores, I separate male, I separate female, I separate into groups. And then you take an SRS of each group. The advantage is it's more precision, and its cost is reduced if you know what the strata are. The disadvantage is sometimes it's difficult to actually divide into groups. It's a more complex formula sometimes, and you must know the population. Okay. All right, the next one we have is systematic. And a systematic is you use a systematic approach, like every 25th person, after starting at a random place. Make sure you use, and you have to clearly explain it so someone can see the pattern and follow it. The advantage of a systematic is it's unbiased. Samples should be evenly distributed across the population, and you don't really need to know the population. The disadvantage is sometimes it's going to have a large variation, which that's what this is, large sigma squared. And it can be confounded. There can be other things that affect it. Okay, so the next one is cluster. Cluster kind of has to go on both pages. Cluster is based on location. And so we select a random location and sample all. This is where you think you have heterogeneous groups, like a mixed group. And so something split into different mixed groups. You take two random mixed groups and you take a census of it. The advantage is it's cost reduced. It can be unbiased, and you don't really need to know the population again. The disadvantage, it may not be representative, and again, it's a complex formula. So systematic and, not systematic, but stratified and clustered. Stratified is homogeneous groups where the groups are like. Cluster are heterogeneous groups where it's a mixed bag. Okay, so the sampling frame, if something's asking you for the sampling frame, it's you need to list everyone in the population. All right, so now let's look at bias. There's a bunch of different sources of bias. The first one is the voluntary response bias. And this is when people choose themselves to participate. The next one is the convenience sample. It's a sample, but it's really just a bias, and you ask people who are easy to ask. And so if I'm going to do a survey, a convenience sample would be I just ask one of my classes instead of randomly selecting students from the school. Undercoverage. Undercoverage happens when some groups or a group is left out of the selection process and does not have the ability to participate. Non-response is when someone cannot or does not want to participate. So they're sent something, but they actually just do not reply. Response bias is sometimes people give false answers. And it's also wording of the question. And response bias also, wording of the question is one. Sometimes we call it response bias if you have leading questions. Response bias also happens if you have maybe an adult or a police officer asking questions. They're not going to answer as truthfully. Okay, so there's then we have observational studies. Observational studies, what you see, you don't manipulate anything, you just look at things, you're just a creeper. Valuable for finding trends and possible relationships. Widely used in public health and marketing. The biggest advantage is that it does not disturb things. The issue with observational studies is you can't prove cause and effect. Now with observational studies, there's two types. There's either retrospective, where you collect data on their past, or there's prospective, where you find people and then you follow them and you watch events unfold. So remember, whenever there's any kind of bias, you cannot recover from a bias. There's nothing you can do. You can't take a bigger sample. It's just going to be more biased. And so you can't recover from bias. These are the different types of bias. If you get confused on the names of bias, then just describe why it's bias. You do not necessarily have to identify the name as long as you're explaining clearly what the bias is and how it affects your results.